But also spiritual experiences isn't about just the intellectual understanding. It's about what the heart experiences. And this is the beauty of what the divine liturgy achieves. If someone asks, what's embedded in this, archaic practice? Well, as a child, I remember the smell, and that tells you there is some sort of a sanctification of the senses. I remember the music. So I went, and I was, in so many words, if I may say, dumbfounded. It was the most beautiful experience I had had. I mean, I heard a message for the first time in the Armenian church, and I was like, wow, you preach. And that's one thing that I would contrast between a seminary world and a university world from my experience, is that we give that to our students. They have their structure of the day, their prayers that are spread out throughout the day, their spiritual training. It's a holistic approach to the human person. The best scripture a person can ever read at times is your life. So your life becomes script. It becomes a book that people read. The martyr is very much, the best way I can also look at it in many ways is an integrated person, heart, mind, soul, strength, that's able to, in the face of the most, we might think death is the scariest thing, right? In the face of the scariest thing, they're able to look at it and say, well, actually, there is something beyond that. So that's why when I see apologetics, people sometimes always associate some sort of attacking posture. No, the apologist is so firm and aware of their possession that they can describe it positively.
Friends, welcome back to Dust and Glory. Today I'm joined by Dr. Ani Shahinian, a scholar, a teacher, and someone who has dedicated her life to studying and serving the Armenian Church. Dr. Shahinian teaches at St. Narcissus Seminary, at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, and Agora University, forming students who are preparing to serve the Orthodox Church in very real and practical ways. At the heart of her doctoral research at the University of Oxford is the theme of Christian martyrdom in medieval Armenia, a subject that speaks not only to history but to endurance, faith, and identity. Dr. Shahinian studies Armenian Christian art, manuscripts, and theology, but she also walks alongside students who are discerning their calling and growing spiritually. Today we'll talk about what it means to teach in a seminary, how souls are formed in theological education, the struggles facing our generation, and the connection between art, theology, and history in shaping Christian identity. Before we start, friends, I'd like to remind you that this video is a collaboration between the WesternDiocese of the Armenian Apostolic Church and myself. We would truly appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel, Olasona, as well as the channel of the WesternDiocese. You'll find all the links in the description down below. And now let's welcome our wonderful guest, Dr. Ani. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for collaboratively creating this environment. Thank you.
When did your journey of faith begin? When did it become a calling for you?
My Christian walk started from a very young age. Sometimes the question of, is this your faith or your parents' faith or your nation's faith? For me, actually, I was very conscious and very aware of it from a very young age. I have memories going as far back as 4 or 5 years old when I would just, want to be in the presence of God in prayer, and wanting to have a special vocation from him, essentially calling on the idea of what it meant to be, a young Armenian Christian girl growing up in America. So I would say I have memories going back to roughly at the 5-6-year-old mark, and spiritual encounters from that early on, wanting to be growing up to be a woman, and loving and doing the things that God had set for me. Scripture was always very early on present and important in my upbringing.
Were you raised in a religious family?
I was.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, my family, having gone through the various traumas and sufferings of our history as Armenians, my parents were very much grounded in understanding and giving significance to their suffering through the Christian faith. So the Apostolic Church was a very foundational place for my family, for my parents. But very quickly, they wanted to, in the desire and the passion for us to actually understand our faith, not just sort of follow it because it's what we do. They found that the Protestant church actually had youth groups that gave scriptural training for the young community, the youth. So that's essentially where we ended up growing up in our spiritual foundation of knowing the Word of God, growing in love for God and others, the virtues of the Christian faith, not only Scripture, but also the living out of your faith. But definitely, as you may imagine, in that context, Scripture was very important. So reading and understanding the Word of God, having your devotions and your meditations and contemplations. That was very, very early on established in me, my siblings, in our family. This was sort of our bread and butter for our spiritual life.
And how did God bring you back to Apostolic Church?
That's a very good story I love to share. So the journey, I love learning about my Christian faith from the different perspectives and experiences. The journey back to Orthodox at the Apostolic Christian faith was one that I think originally planted in me ever since I was that 5-year-old girl, 4-year-old, I would say, when my dad used to hold my hand. I have a vivid memory, almost even in my head, it's like a black and white memory, going to an Armenian Apostolic Church in Soviet Armenia. And hearing the bells, hearing the smelling the candle, and hearing the voices of the men singing the sharaguns. So these were things that just was there always. And then in my Protestant journey, as I became a bit more aware of my faith, discipleship, this idea of what it means to follow Christ, it always led, Scripture is very orthodox. So sometimes we use the word orthodox. What do we really mean? It's like the right teaching. So Scripture has powerful imagery already in writing that kind of guides you and directs you. So I was the first time I was in my studies in Oxford, I had a vision that I wanted to understand what it meant. And it really opened up to me when I started reading Armenian commentaries, the history of the Armenian Vartapets. I had no idea about them at this point. I didn't know very much I knew that my ancestors in Lake Van, Akhtamar, were martyred because they were Christians. I had heard the stories from my father, and for a long time I wanted to know, what is the weight behind this story that's passed down? What is the reality, or the sort of what is embedded in this story that I can actually find and understand? So that kind of took me on that journey of I need to know what happened. I have with my background in investigations, I did sort of cold case, criminal investigation to find out what actually happened to these people in my family who were of priestly heritage. So the long end of it was roughly in my early 20s, actually, living in Washington, D.C. I started a discipleship program where I was a mentee, being mentored by a wonderful group of women and men, part of a institute called the C.S. Lewis Institute. I became sort of, chewing up on the treasures of discipleship making process of what it meant to actually become a Christian who actually followed and lived in the faith. In that process, actually, it very interestingly took me to Oxford, which then in the Oxford world, C.S. Lewis is in the Oxford world. There I met with my future advisors who will tell me a lot about the classical Armenian texts, and then eventually the stories that come with those monasteries and the stories that are embedded, especially in the Lake Van region monasteries and the number of monasteries in that region. So as one thing led to another, I think I have been back on this journey to the roots of my faith, if I may put it that way, ever since this last 15 years. So for 15 years, it's been one chain connecting to the next, creating this beautiful tapestry of really investigating, examining, questioning, and trying to see where it is that I, as a Armenian American woman who's Christian, who carries the traditions of the East and the West, both, like my father is a Western Armenian, my mom's an Eastern Armenian. I grew up in Western America, California, but my whole adulthood has been in the East. So there is this bridging of East and West constantly coming across. And then there is this background of apostolic Christianity, but then this honing of the skills of my Christian faith through the Protestant traditions. So what is happening in this sort of coming together, the convening of the faith in how we read and study about it, but how we live it.
And when did you start participating in the divine liturgy versus in Protestant Bible studies?
Yeah, so my first, I have very early memories of the divine liturgy as a child, which I didn't understand a thing, of course, other than I have the memories. And this is the beauty of what the divine liturgy achieves. If someone asks, what's embedded in this, archaic practice? Well, as a child, I remember the smell. And that tells you there is some sort of a sanctification of the senses. I remember the music. And I don't remember much of my last, in my teenage years in my Protestant tradition. But as a child, I remember these things. And it's so interesting that we've learned to actually awaken or revive the senses through our liturgy. So to answer your question, Sona, I started it early, but my family very much recognizing that, you probably don't understand what's going on. So we really need to go to a place where you can understand scripture and the traditions in a way where it's tangible and articulate. So then the first liturgy that I went to after I was maybe in my early 20s in Washington, D.C. I was working for the government then. And I was in a goose hunt to find a church to plug myself into for my faith. I went from one to the next, and it was just utter disappointment for me. And I realized I'm in a church, church hunting to find a community, and I couldn't. So I went to St. Mary's. And a friend of mine had told me about St. Mary's, and I thought, I've heard about the Armenian Apostolic Church not really being grounded in teaching. There's this liturgical practice that really doesn't seem to make sense, especially for someone who's just attending for the purposes of community. So how are we really communing with God here? So I went, and I was, in so many words, if I may say, dumbfounded. It was the most beautiful experience I had. I mean, I heard a message for the first time in the Armenian church, and I was like, wow, you preach. So yeah, it's like there is, and actually this was a very unique experience because I had not experienced that before in the one or two attempts I had. But this was at the time, so this is currently also Terhovsep in St. Mary's in Washington, D.C. So I approached him and I said, you actually spoke and taught from the scriptures. And he was like, what's wrong with this woman? So that was my first encounter, but it actually became so much richer once I went to England. The Oxford community, I learned to sing sharagans. I never knew anything about the sharag notes, so I learned the sharagans, I learned the liturgical greetings, the responses of the audience. Sometimes we have the yerchahum, the choir responding, but no, this is actually the people. Liturgy means the work of the people.
Yes.
Right? So we're bringing, so I was like all of a sudden learning things for the first time, home away from home kind of thing, So I think that I have not stopped attending a liturgical service ever since 2013. So now we're in my 13th year where I just feel like, how could you go without that? But it's understanding it. Karapar became my sort of second language in many ways to understand these texts. So that's the language of the liturgy. So I understand it. So there's a different discussion to have about what it means for people who don't. But also spiritual experiences isn't about just the intellectual understanding. It's about what the heart experiences. So
Absolutely, yeah. And you do start to understand it within the first year attending the liturgy. I have to say that to people who are a little bit intimidated by a classical Armenian, I have to say that it just takes a few months to start understanding, maybe a full year to comprehend the liturgy. I'm not saying you're going to speak classical Armenian. No, it requires probably years.
Armenian, so.
It probably took you some time, right, to start really understanding it. But in order to understand the liturgy, I think you need a year of consistently going to the liturgy.
Sure. Again, it's practice.
It is, yeah.
It's an attendance of, the presence of the mind, heart, body, soul, strength, all of that in one place.
Absolutely, yeah. You spent many years in academic environment like Oxford. What did you discover there about Armenian Orthodoxy? And also, how did working with manuscripts change your perception of your own faith? Knowing their history, where they come from, who loved them, who cherished them, who preserved them.
Sure.
All of that, yeah.
I have to say, in many ways, going to Oxford, really, there is one place in the world where it's sort of still existing in that medieval context, right? So it's not just the Armenian, but it's the time, it's what we value in the education structures that really gave me not only my Armenian Christian historical context back in the way that I can study it, but a world really, again, Oxford is full of many doors, literally speaking. And it's like which door you walk through, you have to open the doors. And there is a beautiful imagery in there with Oxford. If you don't go through the doors, you don't get to see its gardens. And Oxford's colleges are very lush and elaboratively green and beautiful. With their gardens, but you don't get to see them until you go through the doors. It's all enclosed. So that's the beauty of Oxford. I'm so jealous. Yeah, that's the beauty. Yeah. So once you go through those doors, you're like, oh. So I think for me, the context of the education in Oxford was not only it was in multidimensional, if I may put it that way. So I went through various doors to learn not only about my own Christian journey, my own Armenian Christian history. But a more integrated version of that, because I had the pleasure and the challenge and the joy of participating in Anglican service, a Catholic service. Oxford has prayer service essentially all throughout the day. It's like also almost being in a monastery, because we have morning prayers, afternoon prayers, evening complines, and all these various services, the vigils, and there's constant immersion of the spiritual world.
Are you required, sorry to interrupt, are you required to participate in those services?
You're not. So that's the beauty of it. Depending on the type of degree you're doing in Oxford, if you're in some sort of a priestly training route or a program, there are certain commitments. But for an academic, being part of a college, it's your choice to sign up, for example, for the college chapel's choir. It's your choice to attend the evening evensong, as we call it, sort of the evening prayer, and it almost becomes part of a sort of a tap, like a sort of a service plate of options. Once you attend one service, you want to actually taste the next one, so then it's sort of very appetizing for the spiritual sort of reality that we encompass in us, because once you see it, you're like, okay, yeah, I want to see what this is like. So it has that, it awakens you to that. It has the world for that. And I'm talking about just a college context, because there are also church services all throughout the university city, I should say, not just the university, but various services that go on with the bells ringing at various times of the day, the noon bells, the evening prayer bells, and the morning prayer bells. So yeah,
it really gives a structure to your
does,
day,
and
right?
actually that's what it does for a lot of us students. So the morning prayer becomes, you participate in the morning prayer, then you go on for your 90-minute study. And then you go into your afternoon prayer and you go into your next session. So everything is sort of integrated that way.
Interesting. And working with manuscripts, could you speak a little bit about that? Yes.
So I studied the texts of the martyrs that I was using for my doctoral degree were from manuscripts. Now that's a different sort of stage of my understanding of what manuscripts were until more recently in the last 3 years, as I have been cataloging and studying manuscripts for the Hill Museum Manuscript Library. Now that brings a whole different layer to it. The approach, so thinking about this question at a different level, even a digitized manuscript that I look at, because mostly I look at digitized manuscripts. It's amazing when I approach them in the reverence and awe of what it is and what it actually imparts to you, as opposed to quickly, like, I need to do my work and move forward. That has taught me a little bit about the sacredness of these texts, the process. But more so, when we look at them, the detail. I mean, sometimes I'm thinking, wow, they saw things. They intuited, the depths of the human person. One of the big questions I am so interested in my research is what it means to be a human person in our technological age. And I'm looking at this and I am able to see what they valued the human person to be. It's almost sort of transcendent through their efforts and their works on these manuscript pages. So I very much think that manuscripts are in and of themselves, other than the actual book being an artifact that carries the lives and the stories that it can pass down to you from one hand to the next, beyond what it can actually do as an artifact. The very words on the pages opens up yet another doorway, a path into a world that otherwise remains only for those who seek. It's that the imagery of even Christ's words, knock and the door will be open, seek and you shall find. I mean, I look at these manuscripts and all of that becomes alive for me. So, the beauty of liturgical books, the beauty of the historical record, the beauty of, in Armenian manuscripts, we have like zoomorphic scripts. So these are the trchnagir.
Yeah.
So why
They're
would
beautiful.
why would you do that? And once we realize in some of these that are part of the book of the Psalms or the Sharak notes, the way these birds participate in the process of worship and singing, the way they animate and give color to the page that essentially stands in its sort of, medium. So it becomes a tool in the hands of the Armenian vartapets from the medieval time to actually, we didn't have the opportunity much because of the various political situations in Armenia's history. It's always been, a challenge between various geopolitics or the socioeconomic situation. For, maybe if we look at and contrast it to a place like England in its, most glorious days, there are so many monuments, or even in the Byzantine culture, there's a lot of monuments, a lot of structures that are erected to commemorate the whatever it is important and significant for them. For the Armenians, they do this on these pages. It's like a memorial of a sort.
So interesting.
Yeah.
I remember speaking with our Coptic brothers about the fact that when you enter our old ancient churches, you experience the prayer of the previous generations who came with you, because you feel the holiness of the place precisely because of so many prayers of your ancestors and people who came before you. And would you say you feel the same way touching those manuscripts? You feel the presence of those people who prayed with those books, who held them in their hands?
Absolutely. I mean, I had the absolute pleasure and privilege to do that at the Library of Congress a few years ago, where I actually had the chance to hold the very manuscript in my hands that had transpired not only the history of Jerusalem, capturing the Armenians in Jerusalem, And not only the history of the Armenians in Van and Harpert, but also the American missionaries that had brought it to New York and then donated to the Library of Congress. Wow. So many of those treasures, like that storyline, all in all, how it actually comes together. It's very much the idea of that entering into a world through a medium of this artifact. But in many of the manuscripts I see are digitized. It still has a very powerful, it transports you somehow. Now, moving from the ability to enter into a space of prayer as the continuation of not only the ancestors beforehand, but even what's happening today. I had the privilege of doing that in Akhtamar just a few months ago.
Oh, you've been there.
I've been to Akhtamar twice, but the second visit was entering there, and I was there for the annual liturgy that takes place. Being in the presence of the stones and the frescoes that my own ancestors were witness to 120 years ago. And then I get to actually enter into that space. I'm not sure that that's just the kind of reality that these artifacts and church architecture can actually, provide for us. And it's a gateway in many ways.
It changes you. Those moments really change you.
It does. Yeah.
What's the difference for you to be educated about Orthodoxy and being formed by Orthodoxy?
A minute ago, we talked about words, the word Orthodox, Orthodoxy. What do we mean by it? I always we live in a modern world where a lot of the meaning behind words, there is a connotation that's been, lost. Or we use words that don't necessarily help us to actually, they don't serve the gateway in the way that I'm describing how these manuscripts do. So if I define or understand orthodoxy as right teaching, or if I understand orthodox as correct or righteous way of teaching and living, then I would say what forms that in the educational environment, not just for myself, but how I try to utilize that for my students, is an integrative approach. So it is collaboration between the treasures that we do have access to at our fingertips, essentially. So it's how does actually the educational curriculum come together that I can impart that knowledge, that wisdom forward in a way that is, if we may use the word orthodox, that it's orthodox to do. So it's in the right teaching of how to how to impart that knowledge to someone. So in the educational context, there is the curriculums that are built over many centuries. Actually, in the monastic curriculums, we have insight and treasure of how that is done. So that's sort of the educational part of it. In terms of personal not only the vocation, but the call, I find that we as human beings we're complex creatures. We are in the image and likeness of God. So we have something in our being, in our ontology, and we have something in our teleology, in our will, in how things are shaped, where we bring them together through what's been given to us, what's been handed to us, whether that be the scriptures. I think there are treasures in there, and it is, as we have it in our Armenian word, Astvadzashunch, it's the breath of God that carries us. So in reading and understanding scripture through those lenses, along with how not only church fathers, but how it's been interpreted and understood in the church's history, and how that can illuminate my modern mind today. So all of that kind of shapes as different parts, different arms to the same, conversation about what it means to be formed and shaped in educational ways, but also in the spiritual, devotional ways.
I wanted to speak about you choosing to become a teacher or professor at the first at St. Narcissus Seminary, at St. Vladimir Seminary, and also in Agora University. Yeah. I know these are completely different experiences, I assume. But could you speak about your initial desire to do that? And was it an accident? Was it a very, formed decision over years? Why did you decide to pursue that career?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. It all kind of came together naturally for the most part. After I left my career in Washington, D.C., actually before I left my career, there was already a seed planted about St. Narcissus. I had never heard of St. Narcissus before that point. So a good friend of mine wrote me a very interesting email, which when in my inaugural lecture at the seminary a couple of years ago, my mentor and supervisor, Dr. Roberta Irvin, read that email. It was very, very touching. But that was 13 some years ago. One of my friends talking about St. Narcissus Armenian Seminary in New York and what they do. And I thought, I've never heard of them, actually. So it just sort of went on my list of things to do and a list of people to connect with, this being at the time that my friend was trying to direct me to connect me with was Dr. Roberta Irvin. Now, fast forward 10 years from that day, I'm in Oxford and I'm translating texts for my doctoral dissertation. And another friend and a colleague of mine who is at the seminary was studying at Oxford. And he mentioned, these texts that you're translating, it would be really helpful if you actually talked to Dr. Roberta Irvin. And I thought, that name's come across my desk and email a couple times. I should probably email her this time. So surely enough, I did. And then that was the sort of the starting point of my collaboration with Dr. Irvin. So the moment of starting this conversation with Dr. Irvin, when I was in Oxford working on my doctoral dissertation with my supervisor and mentor, Professor Theo van Lint, and also Dr. Harac Chilingirian. He was my secondary supervisor on my doctoral dissertation. The friendship relationship, mentor-mentee, was very natural. It just sparked this, interest for us to continue translating texts together, which brought about, when I finished my doctorate, where else in the world would you teach Armenian Christian martyrdom? So I was invited to do an intensive course for the seminary a few years ago, about 4 years ago. So in this intensive course, I developed a curriculum for Armenian Christian martyrdom. I mean, it's not a course that's taught. Unless there is someone out there that could say, oh, no, well, there's this course out there. But I don't think there is a course anywhere, a curriculum, like a 15-week semester on Armenian Christian martyrdom. So I developed this course with the interest of doing an intensive session for the students, the seminarians, which then eventually developed into a public lecture. That became the opening for me to probe the possibility to go to the seminary to do more. And it was, again, it could have not worked any better, so to speak. Right at that moment where I had finished my doctorate, I was 3 months away from the ceremony celebrations at Oxford, where I found out that there was a position established at the seminary to do Armenian Christian art and theology. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I applied for that position. And again, had it happened, this is sort of that divine timing question, right? Had it happened few weeks, few months before that, few weeks, few months after that, it would have not worked, because I might have gone in a different direction, and so on and so forth. So in this perfect sort of arrangement of things, collapsing together, I was able to take on this position where I developed courses on what I do now. For the most part, is everything I do, I try to actually bridge the various, approaches to studying, the monastic sort of school almost, bringing texts and images together. And as the Armenian Vartabedagan school is, there were 3 branches to the monastery. It was text-based, art, so illumination-based, and music. So then we have, the art illuminations that we do see as forms of expression of the biblical narratives, especially. So there's a course I designed more recently called Biblical Exegesis in Word and Image. And a more condensed version of it, I am presenting and teaching at a public course level called Christ as the Light of the World in text and image, like how this is actually, expressed not only in the biblical stories we read about, but how did the Armenian artist imagine it? And why imagine it in this way? And how the story was received and understood in this particular time in history. And then, of course, what's another level to all of that is the sharagans. There's music and hymns and worship that are also end up being this third arm to the exploration of the insights of what is actually communicated to us in Scripture.
Interesting. So you started teaching right away, and I assume it was something new for you, right? You used
I was
to teach
teaching before. I was teaching at UCLA.
Oh, okay.
I had taught at various other capacities before the seminary. I had done some tutorials in the Oxford teaching style. It's a bit different. Yeah.
Are there many women teaching at the seminary? Because I have never heard of them before you.
Is that right? Well, Dr. Roberta Urban, she is, the academic dean in many ways. She establishes the curriculum. She's been foundational for the life of the seminary over many years, several decades at this point. There are, there are several good professors at St. Vladimir's that are teaching both theology, history, or art that are women professors.
You don't typically think of a seminary professor as a female. But of course, there are female teachers who are, wonderful professors at seminaries. But do you feel like the way students reacted to a woman being their teacher versus someone who is, considering maybe becoming a priest or is a priest or is a bishop teaching them? Maybe that experience was different. What could you say about
from
that?
the student's perspective?
Yes.
So I teach for Agora. I would say 90% of my students are monks living in the desert. And their approach to me has been so warm and very gentle, very receptive. So first, let me answer the question from my perspective, and then I can say from a student's. So from my perspective, I have been, whether it was in my investigation career in government or whether it was being in a Armenian family context as a woman, or whether it was in whatever vicinity of life circumstances, there's always been the challenge of being a woman. But I would say none of that has ever deterred me to say, well, I'm a woman, so I can't. Or because I'm viewed a certain way. I don't think it really, I think it's a matter of how we approach it. So, I'm sure there's a lot of times now in our modern world where men aren't accepted in many ways, so it's like, would a man stand up and be like, well, I'm a man, so maybe I should be careful about X, Y, or Z, so I think it's more about how we approach it than how people perceive us. So I've learned that in my various capacities as a woman, being mostly in places where around the table, I might be the only woman. Sometimes with older men that is, whether it's a board meeting, whether it's a university council, whether it is a seminary. My approach has always been, I'm in the image and likeness of God. I'm a daughter of God. You're a son of God. This is great. So my attitude has always been such that it doesn't carry those barriers. So if someone is viewing it as a barrier, I don't see it like that. So immediately my approach calibrates. It recalibrates the discussion or the feeling. I've had students, in various other contexts talk about, oh, you're a woman, why are you teaching priests? I think it's a great opportunity for me to actually then be an exemplary, model to say, well, let's talk about that. It's very interesting you have that question, because when people have those needs and questions, there is something there to actually grab on and engage.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is it that you struggle with from a woman teaching? And then of course we sometimes get all kinds of extrapolated single verses from Timothy or Ephesians. And I love engaging those conversations, to be honest, because the first method of approach for me as an Armenian is one who's an apologist. Armenian Christians are innately apologists because of what we had to be in the context of the Islamic world.
True.
Yeah, the apologist is not someone who's constantly attacking the other side. The apologist
in a debate.
In a debate. No. So that's why when I see apologetics, people sometimes always associate some sort of attacking posture. No. Yeah. The apologist is so firm and aware of their position that they can describe it positively. So as an apologist, I can...
The best description you gave for apologetics, yeah.
So that's what I see as myself as as a woman apologist. I am very much in the position to give a defense for why, as a woman created in the image of likeness of God, I can actually do what I do. But immediately, I don't want to shut down my student who might see that as a problem, because I see him as an image and likeness of God. So there is something in their chemistry of mind, body, soul, strength that's being tuned. So why would I actually interrupt that? So I welcome those challenges. I think they're very, very much of an entry point into a discussion, into sort of honing what it is that will come of them. Often, in our monastic tradition, we have very much, and this is an area that really very much deserves a bit more exploration writing. So if anyone's interested in a doctoral dissertation, this would be a good one to think about the role of women in monasteries, so what they actually gave. We have traditions from the story of Gregory, the illuminator, we know that, a woman actually fed him while he was in the lion's den, so to speak. So what is that model? What's going on there? Or what kind of role did women actually, encompass in the bringing up of these men? I mean, obviously they came from a mother, So sometimes the obvious we don't really think about. So what does it mean? What does it mean? And this is sort of the invitation to even mothers to what does it mean to raise men? What does it mean to have little boys to actually equip and instruct and give the disciplinary and the sort of that skills, the toolkit for them to become men, because they're not always going to stay boys. So that's also, women start in their abilities to actually raise that beginning from the family, the home, the education environment, in any other sort of context in the world. Women have that not only the nurturing, but the wisdom, the ability to see through things from a different angle and make that contribution.
Yeah, interesting. What are some of the most interesting conversations you had with your students that you can recall? And also, what are the things that you want them all to learn early on in their journey, if they're discerning to become clergymen, if you're discerning a vocation. What would you like them to know, and also be prepared for the world they're stepping into? Because they are going to be, most of them will probably be young by the time they step into the world of confession, for instance, and they will have to hear the confessions. And it's not an easy world to step in. I mean, it's they have to basically deal with the human nature, human heart. And yes, what is the advice you give them?
Well, they can't do it on their own ever. They're always accompanied by the Spirit. They're accompanied with, there is so much we do in the ability of filling their toolkit with things that they can carry with them. But ultimately, first and foremost, I think the priestly training requires the spiritual disciplines of, and we are in Lent season at this point. So this idea of what it means to hone our prayer life, disciplined prayer life, not just, I'm in traffic and I'm stuck and I'm praying, no, disciplined prayer.
That is also a valued prayer, though.
Absolutely. But sure. But again, for someone who is going to be on a track to become a priest, what is their discipline for, one of the three arms of the Lenten season is, prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. We talk about this in multiple different directions and ideas. So I think training priests in their full being, from heart, mind, soul, body, ultimately comes down to the disciplines. But what are the disciplines? Like, what are we really entering into? Very often I talk to my students, they have questions about their vocation and calling. What am I going to do? Like, when I become a priest, how is this going to work? They have so many questions, so many uncertainties, so many things that are, troubling them about, am I going to be a monk? Like, am I going to be a vartapet? Am I going to be a married priest? Am I going to, there's all kinds of real life issues that really burden their minds.
I can imagine.
I think, it's a vocation. Becoming a priest is a call. You don't just decide that you're going to become a priest because it looks cool with all the costumes that we're wearing, with all the colors, and I just want to do that. Sometimes, I've had students who have that kind of understanding of priesthood. They just think it's kind of cool to do that.
That's kind of sad.
Right? No, but it's a question of vocation. It's a call. It's wanting to bring the persons into the presence of God. So you are becoming that sort of, in many ways, sort of that counselor that, you're articulating the word of God, not only in your words, but also in the Eucharist that you're actually presenting. So you become in many ways the person who hones their spiritual well-being. So training them for that requires honing their spiritual disciplines, whether be it the virtues. I'm very much on a project translating a lot of our monastic teachings on the virtues. The monks were very aware of this, about the importance of being sober-minded, the importance of, faith, hope, and love. These are in many ways in the epistles of Paul, or even later on in the explorations of the church fathers. These are things we practice. These are not just some things we just put it on a shelf. The importance of prudence, decision making. This is a very difficult one in our world today.
Oh, yeah.
There's like overload of decision making. We make so many small decisions about whether I should eat this or that, wear this or this, that by the time we are actually supposed to make a very important decision, it just becomes exhausting.
So true.
So I think it's that part of it too. It's like, how do we train them from early on to put on the virtues? And in the Armenian Vartapetagan sort of language, often it is wearing these things on you as clothing. Paul describes this, right? He says, put on the belt, the helmet of truth, right? So the courage So he describes them as clothing features that actually gird us and strengthen us. So I think there is something to be said about that in terms of training and talking to priests. To go back to some of the questions about students who have approached me, I would say for the most part, it's very real and human concerns. It's not some sort of heavenly concerns. It's very earthly and human concerns. They want to be certain about things. And I always say, well, the cemetery is quite certain. There is...
The end is quite certain.
Yeah, so we know that we're going there. So certainty is something that plagues us quite a bit. And that's something where the Christian teachings actually equip us to have more confidence in contrast to certainty. And the virtues help with this. And sometimes, again, not to over glorify virtues, because that can be the other, spectrum of things. They're simply tools. We practice them. During this Lenten season, we're going to practice a handful of them. Hopefully some of them more. And then this is the idea of what it becomes over time, the ability for the priest himself, as in their educational journey, they obtain the very things which then they're going to, impart, whether it's in their message or whether it's in the way of their being. Because the best, there is this famous, Anglican pastor's words that, it doesn't matter who said it, it's true kind of idea, is that the best scripture a person can ever read at times is your life. So your life becomes script. It becomes a book that people read. So it's very important for our lives to be also exemplary. So teaching the priests in that direction of how to live that.
In your opinion, what are the biggest struggles modern seminarists go through? Is it attention problems, attention span problems? Is it maybe a fear of commitment? What are your observations in this?
Good question. Actually, as you're saying that, what I'm thinking of is you're thinking of my modern seminarians, but there's a text Dr. Roberta and I translated, actually one of the very early ones when we came together, and it was Matthäus Vartapet Juhayetsi. It's this beautiful colophon, and he is just livid with his students. And he's just complaining about how lazy they are, about all the vainglory, about all of it just goes on and on. It's a beautiful colophon.
Is it translated?
It is. I translated that. So
I would love to read it.
Yes. Yeah. So this was written sometime in 1409, 1410, right after the passing of the very, renowned Vartapet Grigor Tatevatsi, and Matthäus Juhayetsi takes over the monastery, the Datev monastery, and he's training these monks and priests, and he's telling a little bit of the experience of what it's like. Now, not to extrapolate 700+ years later and say nothing's changed. Not so much. Now, I think a lot of it's in our modern preoccupations, attention span is a big problem. That we are so preoccupied with so many things, attention is difficult. What I see to be a common issue is the discipline of structuring a day so that you can actually do all the things that you are commissioned to do in this vocation. So ordering your day becomes something that, the very great, medieval, both in the Western and Eastern traditions that actually mastered was, how they divided the day in order to be able to master all that is that they were supposed to accomplish. So I think that's one struggle that's very real. Another struggle really is, again, it's contrasting the virtues to the vices. At the seminary, Dr. Roberta and I are actually running a international conference this summer on June 4, 5, and 6 on the Desert Father, Evagrius. And he writes about the 8 thoughts of sin. And the way I see it is when I look at sort of, for example, the one on laziness or the one on sadness, despondency, You know, there's almost like a mirror contrast of these vices to the virtues. So there is the problem. It's not, we should not be in a position to beat it over our heads that we're having this problem. But then there's a solution. So there is, again, it's common. It's not so much so that it's these students in the seminary today. It's more human, really, at the end of the day. And it's been written about for thousands of years at this point. So I think it's more about how do we obtain the discipline. And one of the best things we can do at a seminary context is to give them that structure. And that's one thing that I would contrast between a seminary world and a university world from my experience, is that we give that to our students. They have their structure of the day, their prayers that are spread out throughout the day, their spiritual training. It's a holistic approach to the human person. So it's the heart. It's educating the heart, not just the mind. It's educating the soul. It's giving them a time for them to have those emotional moments of like, what do I do with this? And take that. You can't really take that to the books, but you can take it into, you know, a vigil service perhaps, or to your mentor that you can actually process, or you can actually read and write through it, you know, in that topic. So there's a lot of ways to approach that. And I think that's one of the treasures of what we've discovered in also monastic training, where there is this more one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three sort of approach versus the university lecture hall.
So it seems like structure and discipline is what students mostly struggle with, right?
It's in our modern world, absolutely.
Do you think the struggles that your students have today are the same as 1,000 years ago? Obviously, some of them are not the same, but generally, are they struggling with the same thing, with the criticism that you found of their teachers of them? What are some of the conclusions that you made?
Yeah, I think there are some things that are innate to us all, regardless of the times we live in. You know, laziness is common to human beings. You know, despondency, the question of meaning and significance. These are things that probe our hearts and minds, regardless of what century we live in. But it just manifests in different ways sometimes. Like now, the question of attention is manifesting in different ways. You know, I read colophons by scribes who are complaining that they don't have attention. Like they're struggling with focus, but they wrote thousands of folios of manuscripts. And I'm thinking, okay, so what's the standard of what we're talking about? So
much higher standard.
So obviously the question of struggling with attention is innate. So they are struggling then in the ways that they are. We are struggling now in the ways that we are. So what do we do with that is the question. You know, so in many ways, sometimes these scribes who are complaining about this, it's a prayer. As they're writing, it's sort of an inscribed prayer for focus, or for their work not to be wasted or lost, or, you know, in many ways that's how they are able to understand their struggle. So what do we do with ours? You know, that's the question we are left with.
I wanted to speak about the subject of your study, martyrdom of Armenians in the Middle Ages. You know, when we are thinking about martyrdom in the modern world, we're always depicting very dramatic, you know, deaths and suffering. What has surprised you in the manuscripts that you found that is very unique and no one knows about?
Yeah. You know, the word martis, I always start my course by defining the word, it actually means testimony, like a witness, to testify, right? Witness. So this idea of the dramatic deaths that are embellished with the idea of martyrdom, that's a development. And some of them are dramatic, some of them are not. Ultimately, I would say the treasures that we come across speaking from my own experience of translating and working with the Armenian martyr texts, my comment can come at two different levels. One, actually, what it means to read these texts. That's a whole different question. But what these texts eventually end up opening our world to understand about martyrdom is that, this question of what do we do in the moment of conflict where there is resistance. We're invited for resistance, or we're invited to stand, in between two very difficult situations. A lot of times what we see over and over again is that not to call them martyrs from the beginning of the story, but a man or a woman is, positioned with a challenge that often, especially in the Armenian martyr texts of the medieval world, they're often very day-to-day issues. It's not some grandiose sort of, unimaginable activity. No, it's very real. It's very tangible. It's very, practical. And these things bring about the kind of conflict, the kind of problems, the kind of, tension that once it's erupted, once all of the, issues come to its surface, the martyr chooses to enter in that suffering, or the Christian man or the Christian woman representing the faith in this, context. They are not afraid. They have a sort of a worldview to go into the suffering without the fear of, it's essentially they're not giving into the fear or the manipulation or the invitation or the, whatever the vainglory or the false promises of the other side could be, for them to actually escape persecution or suffering. They realize something more innate is taking place, and they step into it thinking, well, actually, I am in a position to give a defense and believe in what it is that I know is true. So an example illustrates much better by, looking at one of the cases with, actually, I'll go with the central figure of my doctoral thesis, Zacharias Katerikos. He was martyred in 1393. The story is phenomenal. What happens is, in any world, you would think he could have gotten away. There was a way for him, as the head of the Armenian church in that time, to find a way to kind of wiggle through, maneuver out of this very traumatic event. But he chooses not to. Because ultimately on the other side, there is something else that he will face. So he chooses to stand in the truth of his conviction, to say, essentially the invitation is that if he was to become Muslim, that whatever is being accused against him will be forgiven. Now the question is, if Katerikos Zakaria was easily manipulated to save his skin, to save his body from, this judgment, if that is actually then going to get him on the other side by him being unfaithful to the very oath that he's taken, what's waiting for him on that other side?
Yeah.
So
good question.
So that's, the martyr is very much, the best way I can also look at it in many ways is the integrated person, heart, mind, soul, strength, that's able to, in the face of the most, we might think death is the scariest thing, right? In the face of the scariest thing, they're able to look at it and say, well, actually, there is something beyond that. And the martyr has that belief beginning from the moment in their Christian journey, from the moment of baptism all the way through the point of their death. They know that from the moment of their, stepping into the Christian faith as a baptized Christian, they are being baptized in Christ's suffering. They have this understanding. A martyr really generally, lives that testimony, not just only in their words, as it is communicated to us by how the story is passed down, but also in that moment being a witness, an example for how a person ought to be in such challenging times. So we have hundreds, if not thousands, of those examples. So it's not impossible. Like you and I can be that. So
we're all called to to be saints. Yeah.
Exemplary, the exemplary ones give us it just sort of takes away this, it dispels the false notion that we can't do this. You too, I too, can actually stand firm in those moments.
Wow, that interesting conclusion that you made. It made it so personal to you, especially knowing that your great-grand-ancestor, great-great-grandfather was one of those people who had that integrity, that Christian identity that they didn't want to compromise. That is so beautiful. And you learn about the story of your grandfather early on your journey to Orthodoxy, right?
Oh, yeah. I knew about their stories as a 6-7-year-old growing up. It was always in the background of my sort of conscience. It was always present with me. It didn't really revive until I was in my 20s.
And he's one of those martyrs canonized, right, by the Armenian Church.
Yeah, he would be. He was a priest. Well, actually, the story is
he would be a hero martyr, right?
Hero martyr,
because he's a priest and a martyr. So
generally, yeah. So the hero word, interesting to kind of put them together, is the warriors of the Greek world, right? That were associated with this hero mentality. Yeah. So there's a very interesting kind of overlapping of the hero martyr. But for just very quickly about my great-great-grandfather and uncle, who was a priest in Vartapet in Akhtamar. They were martyred sometime between 1890, I want to say 96, 95, 96 in Akhtamar. So they were one of the last priests to leave the island. So their story is very powerful in the sense that, they weren't the only martyrs in this period, of course. But I wanted to understand, what resilience they passed down, even not just by knowing the history, but by just being there, in many ways, in the legacy of their generation. Like what has passed down to me that I must be faithful. Perhaps, I don't know whether a martyr or not, but at least faithful as a woman in the 21st century to actually serve in that lineage. So for me, studying a medieval martyr like Kateriko Zakaria, who was the head of the Akhtamar church, and
so many parallels. Wow.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is Kateriko Zakarias' martyrdom actually in my overall sort of assessment is that it actually gave the life of the church in Akhtamar another 500 years. Because had he converted to Islam, we would have lost essentially imagine the local emir would have taken over the island. The Christians, what would happen to the Christians when their leader just converted to Islam?
We know what happens to them.
So, they eventually, if not within a generation, within a few generations, they will easily, lose that, the structure in which they are growing as Christians. So not that to say it's only dependent on that, but Zakaria stood in that and created the platform for Akhtamar to be an enclave, a very protected and very rich enclave for Armenian Christians for another 500 years. And of course, it ends with the last Katerikos right before the genocide. But we would have not had that 500 years if it wasn't for that moment.
Wow.
So in a sense, I find myself very much connected to that story because my ancestors coming as priests of Akhtamar, there is a way that they were able to be who they were and faithfully serve and faithfully and loyal, being servants of the word in their time because of what had gone before them. So what has gone before me? What am I willing to put forward for the next generation?
Incredible. I think they are very proud of you. Looking at you.
I hope so.
The cloud of witnesses.
The cloud of witnesses. We are. And that's the treasure of going back to a little bit of that transition of more traditional, our Orthodox apostolic faith, is that we're not alone. Yeah. We're not alone not because of what we are surrounded by today. No, we have cloud of witnesses from essentially first century onwards and even before. I mean, we go back essentially, what is it? The whole scriptures testify to Christ, So that's what he says, right? On the road to Emmaus, where he's saying, these were the scriptures that testified about me. So we enter into that. We become, because of Christ, we enter into that at any part of human history by knowing him, by living, being awakened to his reality. We live into that.
I really wanted to ask you about your experiences and how different they are teaching at St. Vladimir Seminary, at St. Narcissus Seminary, and then at Agora University, because you are, from what I understand, in Armenian seminary, obviously you're teaching Armenians, and then Eastern Orthodox at St. Vladimir, and then Oriental Orthodox Armenians and Copts and Ethiopians, I assume, are coming to Agora University and learning about their theology and Christology. Could you speak about how what is it the same persona teaching in different universities? Do you have to adapt, or what was that experience like?
Yeah, so it's different capacities. I design all my courses. When I taught at UCLA, I taught someone else's courses. So it's designed for you to sort of fit into a curriculum that is taught in a way you have to meet requirements. What's different between all of these three institutions now that I actually get to have the privilege to work with, I design my own courses. So in many ways, I am able to bridge different ideas, methodologies, aspects of learning for the students. At St. Narcissus, seminary context altogether doesn't really change very much for me, because my students at the seminary at St. Narcissus also attend St. Vladimir's. So that comes together. So when I teach a course, I have students from both seminaries together. Some of them are in the trajectory of becoming priests. Some of them are not. So it just depends on, at a more personal level, if, there are other ways to sort of meet their specific needs when it comes to the education of the full person. Sometimes that differs. At Agora, it's very interesting. I love seeing the contrast of the type of questions that come up, the interest, the curiosity. It's very I learn a lot from my students, because sometimes something triggers and they have an interest in a direction that I had never thought about. So that explores my opportunity to enhance my course first. So it's in many ways I can prepare and I can design, but nothing is complete until the audience is actually completing that aspect of it. So the same course I can teach at St. Narcissus, and then I can actually teach it to a different audience, different ideas end up becoming part of the discussion. I designed a course that I taught with Agora on the question of dehumanization and the Armenian genocide. So that was a whole different experience. Obviously, it's a very different question, but the running theme of witness is there. The running theme of what it means to be human, the running theme of the various challenges and the characteristic of resistance, and this question of entering into suffering with the other. These are all present.
And how are you teaching the differences between our Christology and theology? Those differences, how do you explain them in a respectful and also inviting manner?
Yeah.
Because, obviously you're coming from Miaphysitism, right? From our Oriental Orthodox teaching, coming to the Eastern Orthodox University seminary. Do you have to explain yourself? Do you get a lot of questions about that? Did you ever have any, not conflicts, but I guess arguments?
Not really, actually. This is why I love the environment of education, because that's where you have to have, there's this, saying that what good is it to speak to people who you agree with? What do you learn when two agreeing people constantly nod their heads and say, yes, you're right, you're right. That to me isn't a context in which to bring like exquisite thought. So at the Vladimir's context, I've never had any problems, but I go back to, so there's quite a bit to talk about the question of as we now phrase it as Miaphysite or Diophysites. The dialogue is embedded in at least 1500 year church history about why this was a problem, and why did this happen? So there's a lot there. So as a point of entry, if someone is really interested in that and they're not just saying it because they've heard the word and they know that there is a divisive question, and that sometimes that's what happens. This is where I kind of differentiate polemics from apologetics. They just want there's an aggression and they want to actually say about something that they think they know. And in that moment,
they want quick answers too.
And quick answers, but it's not like, it's not it's not a question of there's an exquisite idea or thought. This is more about a question of the heart. As an apologist, I'd always say I don't try to win people over to Christ with logic. It just the last time I checked my
could, but it's
I suppose
hard.
you could, but the question is like the last time I checked my heart, logic really doesn't make a lot of sense there. So oftentimes these are heart issues. So to address the question of this tension on the Council of Chalcedon essentially is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
To me, it's not a problem. My students don't give me problems about that.
That's good.
What's important about it is to know and to educate what happened at the Council of Chalcedon. Why were Armenians not there? What are we really disagreeing about? Is it just language or is there more to it? So as an educator, it's very important to be present with whatever it is that they are asking. In a classroom setting, it's always important for me to cultivate an environment that when a opposing view is presented, that person is heard. Because if not, and let's just say the other person has so much so the right theology, how can that person be heard? So there is a question of respect. And from my own journey, as having gone through all different types of Christian expressions for the last 30 plus years, I know that in my journey, there was a time when I thought I knew it all. There was a time in my journey that I knew that the Apostolic Church is not right because they're not teaching Scripture. Or the Greek Orthodox is doing X, or the Latin or tradition, they're worshiping images. There's always a moment in our journey where we might think that we understand or know better. And that's okay, especially in an education environment. A student starts there.
Part of growing up.
I mean, I'm not a mother, but as a mother of 3, you understand, right? There's a season in their lives where whatever that focus and obsession is, that's what it is. But in education, I think for me, that's an exciting opportunity to enter into that discussion. The beautiful discussion of Christ's nature, of fully God, fully human, is we can't even figure out ourselves. We're not even claiming divinity in us. Although in sort of the Athanasian sort of theology, he became man so that we can become divine. So there's this sort of transparency, right? And this transcendency. So who am I in my limited vantage point of this one center? And I love the description of light. We are all lights. We are all a center of light that sort of reflect Christ. So in the way I'm reflecting, for me to look at the other person and say, no, you are not doing this properly. So there is definitely a room for actually identifying what is right and true. We have to be able to be grounding. We have to ground and center on that. But also, the tension is in the fact that we are not perfect. We don't see it fully.
Absolutely.
So because I don't see it fully, I mean, I might see an aspect of it today, And then the next day it's like, oh, that new idea that developed that I see now actually adds or takes away from what I thought I knew. So there is this, if I may put it in this way, this finitude to us. How are we trying to understand the infinite God who became man, that he allowed us to even know about it? You know, there's in the theological sense, like we would have never known had he not chosen to disclose himself. That's the hiddenness of God. He chose to reveal. He chose to be known. And now we're going to fight about whether he revealed himself as a Miaphysite or a Deiphysite. What are we talking about? What's the motivation? What's the heart behind it? So I always like to say, as a historical theologian, I look at the idea and I try to see what was happening around it. There's a lot happening with Arianism a few decades and a century before. There is a lot that's happening in the 5th century already that develops not only language translation, although philology is a very important reason why certain things get misunderstood or transmitted in a way that wasn't necessarily the original intent. So this is all very legitimate. But there is also the sociopolitical, geopolitical context of that time.
Oh, yes.
What is going on? And then once we're having discussion at that level, at no point then are we saying, well, the Armenians have it right and the Greeks have it wrong. You know, or the Protestants are, you know, completely off the charts on this matter and the Armenians are completely on the right on this matter. No, this is divisiveness. This is the spirit of divisiveness. It's more about a more integrated vision of what is actually, you know, central and important for our students to be able to understand about God, about them, about their community, this sort of vertical idea, this horizontal approach, the cross, and bring that to their communities. Ultimately, that is the aim of an educator.
You're an educator who is not discerning the vocation of marriage. Let's put it that way. You're not thinking of marriage or having kids, right? But you're also not, from what I understand, discerning vocation of celibacy and becoming a nun, right? I don't even know if, yes, I suppose we can.
Yeah.
There's still a group of Armenian nuns in Echmiadzin. I think there were at some point 7. Now they're less than that. But because I get that question a lot asked on my page, on my YouTube channel, women asking, like, I'm not, you know, I don't think that motherhood is for me, but I want to serve God, but I also don't think that I should go to the monastery and lock myself in the monastery because I want to live in this world. What is your advice to these women, and how can they serve our Lord without making maybe radical decisions about their life, whether it's marriage or becoming a bride of Christ?
Yeah. Well, my first advice would be, don't force yourself into marriage just because that's what everyone says you ought to do or you should do, or that's the way for a woman to express their most important call, which is motherhood. And I believe that is one of the most treasured, important calls for women. From my personal journey, ever since I was very young, and this is very personal, I never felt that vocation that I mean, I'm very nurturing. People will describe me as I'm very nurturing and I would be a wonderful mom. But I have not seen it. I have not seen it in my own thinking that that's what I need to do. I'm not convinced. So I can listen to other people and do it. And I believe that's danger. That's a dangerous spot. I think what's important for the women who are asking these questions, first and foremost, it's not an either or. I have to be married or I have to go to a monastery. I think for me, my journey has been to learn, and again, this is an everyday journey for me, what does it mean for me to be Christ-like in my mind, in the way I think about it, in my heart, the emotions and the feelings that I do have? How do I train that in my body in order to actually be virtuous, to be able to live in the world and do what it is that I believe I'm supposed to do, not necessarily confined to the structures of marriage or monastery. It's not an easy place to be. If I were to advise, I wouldn't think that it's very smart to have women like me just not in marriage or in monasteries, just floating around. That would not be my advice. But if you are in that position, I would say really grounding yourself. There is this idea that I'm developing, and I feel like next to martyrdom, maybe this is the idea that I would essentially spend the next 20, 30 years, 40 years working on, is the Armenian understanding of anzanishchanutzion. This is in English, or in the Western philosophical world, we think of it as free will, or the freedom of the human will. So what does it mean for me to be anzanishchan, and yet fully aware that I am not sort of independent, disconnected from both the divine and also other humans? So this idea that if you're a woman not necessarily called or feeling the pull in either directions, what is your life, what is your thinking and your feeling and your being directing you to? So what are you doing with your life? What are you actually proposing and positioning yourself to be? And I'm assuming these women, if we were to talk to them, they're women who have conviction. They have some sort of a pull in some direction. What is that? Yeah. What is that? Hone your skills to do that. And I would always say it's very important to protect yourself, in the sense that, if you are not in those, protections, marriage or monastery, you're open. So it's much easier for you to be experiencing all kinds of, attacks, whether it's the vices, all kinds of various emotions and feelings that can actually deter you from the path that God has for you. So if you are a woman who is actually struggling with this decision, I would say first and foremost, a discipleship program is very important. Be with other women. Be with, you don't have to be in a monastery context. Be with, or in a nunnery. Be with women who also are part of that community. So there is, I always say in most of my contexts where I'm speaking to women, make sure, almost 100% of the time, if possible, that you are being mentored by someone older than you, and you are mentoring someone younger than you. So there is this sort of, open line. So there is a moment of confession and learning and, being exposed, while at the same time, you're an example to the woman that you are mentoring. That keeps you grounded to a degree. That's what you would potentially do in a sort of a monastic setting anyway. But if you're someone who's not going to essentially take the vows, at least protect yourself with that kind of structure where you have women who love the Lord, who are good thinkers and can actually walk with you, so you're not alone. Because this journey on earth, you can't do it on your own.
If God has a path for you in the future, whether to get married or devote your life to Christ, would you be open to accepting that if he has something prepared for you?
Absolutely.
Along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love, the idea of marriage is beautiful. It's the most intimate love you have on earth. You know what marriage also is? The idea of the wills. I'm very much interested in the anzanishchanutzion, understanding the human will. Well, maybe the best way I'm going to understand it is through marriage, because there is this idea of, bringing two wills together. And now what are you going to do with this? It's just a question of the setup and how the timing and everything hasn't arranged for that in my life. Who knows? Maybe I walk out of this interview and, I end up actually going towards marriage. Who knows? I don't know.
Someone will watch.
Someone, exactly. I am not saying no to marriage. I'm not saying no to monasticism. But I think what I'm saying is, Lord, especially in my daily practices, I want to be constantly poured into my life by a godly woman who is older than me and has gone through this path, because I don't want to do it alone. Even if there is some happenstance of a chance that I can do it alone, I don't want to. It just doesn't work like that. But I also look down, like, next to me, who is there that I can actually bring with me? So I'm constantly in that model. And like, I think about my nieces, I think about my sister, I think about my girlfriends, I think about their friends, you know. I think about my students, you know, what kind of model, exemplary life do I want to have for them? And if there was someone that actually sees the vision and the mission that God has brought together, then we can do it together. I think that's a really a harmonious bridging of it together.
Yeah, I mean, that idea of fellowship and community is so foreign to many of us, you know, nowadays. It was so natural back then for people to live in those communities, and the fellowship at church was just something that they lived and breathed in. Right. And now you have to educate people again once more, like your course that you created and the lectures, right, about connecting with other women.
Yes.
Through the Word of God, or through the teaching of the fathers, or even just our lived experiences. It's just so beautiful and so valuable because it's not common. People don't do that anymore. I suppose some churches have that, but I feel like that's something that we have to really work on, to create those bonds with elder women and younger women. It almost feels like we're all, well, we live in a much more isolated society, obviously, but it almost feels like somehow we became enemies, and that is just so not the way God intended it to be. Even in the Old Testament, you can see that connection that women had with each other. In the New Testament, you can see the mirth-bearing women, you know, being one community and serving Christ.
You know, actually, you talked about the mirror-bearing women, and I thought of the early traditions of women who were not married, or you know, we have the story of Tekla, who was engaged, and then because she finds this mission and this vocation and mission, a vision to follow and, you know, teach and do the life of essentially a nun in many words, to the point where she's living in a cave at some point, right? She ends up separating from her fiancé. So there are examples in history from the first year of Christianity of what it was like to be a non-married woman. I mean, for all purposes, you know, we have example of Mary in the scriptures. What did she end up doing when she chose Christ? She lived a holy life. She followed him. So if you're going to do that, live that life. It's not impossible. You know, immerse yourself, you know, as a woman in the context and in the structures that will give you that. Unfortunately, our society is not welcoming for that, because, you know, there's this essence of, if you don't invest in your own self finding that, then you're often left on your own. So there is that vice of, you know, despondency and loneliness. You know, all of that can kick in. The idea is that it's actually innate to human beings, whether you're married or not. So don't get married because you're lonely, because that's
the wrong way to.
That is not going to solve the problem. So I think we have example of women, and this is one area that I'm also working on, in addition to this idea of the freedom of the human will and the attaching of that will to the divine will. So Ansnishchanution, martyrdom, but particularly women martyrs. In many of those cases, these women are sometimes married, sometimes not married. They're sometimes, you know, in their 20s, sometimes they're in their 50s. So there is example all across the board for women who are young, married, old, not married, single, divorced, widowed. It's the reality of what it means to be human on a spectrum of a lifespan. It's what we do with it.
It's beautiful. Where can people find you, Ani? On social media, on other platforms, in real life?
Yeah. So I teach at the seminary in New York. So welcome to visit at St. Narcissus Armenian Seminary in Armonk, New York. I spend half of my year in the Western Diocese context here, where I try to teach and live from where I'm in my family town where I grew up and where I'm from. So if you're in LA, I'd love to see you. I actually have a group of students here who have not yet committed to seminary studies, but we do regular meets. And I think that's always very encouraging to hone the skills of, whether it's language or reading or the discipline of time management before you even come to the seminary. I do have a Facebook page. I'm very happy for you to follow and find me on there. I try to post some of my activities, whether it is with my work on manuscripts, my speaking engagements. That can be on LinkedIn is also a place you can find me. I'm quite old style with social media. I'm still developing an Instagram page, but please feel free to find me on there as well. But really the aim is to connect in the heart, the mind, the soul, the strength of each other in the various wonderful platforms that our modern world gives us. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Ani, for sharing your wisdom and your story. It was wonderful to hear it. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me at your podcast. Thank you for what you're doing. And may God strengthen you as a mother, as a woman who is in the journey of becoming more like him.
Wow. Thank you. On that note, thank you so much. And I hope to see you again on the podcast.
Thank you, Sona. God bless you.
Friends, I would like to thank Dr. Ani for sharing her scholarly work, but also her heart for the church and for students who are being formed for service. What I am taking from this conversation is that theology is not meant to be a content. We're meant to become different people through it. And Armenian tradition carries that transformation through prayer, beauty, memory, and witness. Friends, if this episode encouraged you, please support the channel by subscribing, sharing, and leaving a thoughtful comment. Those small actions truly help us to grow, and these conversations reach the people who need them. Every conversation draws us a little closer to each other and closer to God. Until next time, dear friends, goodbye.